Quick test. When I say Crimean War, what flashes up first? Balaclava, Florence, Nightingale, perhaps frozen redcoats. All fair enough. But what if the war's real pressure points were nowhere near the cavalry, and the key decisions happened where charts, tides and trade routes matter more than bayonets? Yep, it pains me to say I'm not a naval guy, but sometimes we have to tip our hat to the senior service and admit that from time to time those lads really did know what they were doing. At the latest Victorian Military Society conference, Professor Andrew Lambert gave a fantastic talk that reframes the whole thing. In this film we'll trace a thread from the Baltic to Sevastopol, past blockades and bases most people never talk about, and watch an empire slowly run out of options. We'll see why engineers, surveyors and a new breed of warship changed the tempo, and why one spectacular victory barely made the papers. It's fascinating stuff. So here's the puzzle. How do you win a war and defeat a major world power when marching to their capital isn't an option? When logistics are against you? When you have, let's be honest, a tiny army? Well, don't click away, because today we'll get the answer to all of those questions. By the way, special thanks to the Victorian Military Society for letting me use this clip. I'm heavily involved with them and will give more details about the VMS later.
The Crimean War is a war that encapsulates what made Britain a great power in the 19th and well in the 20th century. It is a maritime strategic campaign intended to weaken and defeat a major great power rival, preventing worse outcomes. What is the Crimean War about? It's about stopping the Russians overrunning the Ottoman Empire, destroying a major British economic base, and spreading their influence into the Mediterranean, where they would have been a real nuisance. It's also about releasing the Scandinavian countries from the dominance of Russia around the Baltic, and that has very strong echoes of what happened after 2022, when Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO. Before 1854, Sweden was effectively dominated by Russia. Finland was a Grand Duchy of Russia. It was under Russian control. And Poland and the Baltic states were all part of Russia as well. Russia controlled the Baltic. And Britain depended on a lot of trade from the Baltic for vital raw materials, ranging from grain and timber to hemp and flax. So this was a major strategic region. Indeed, my argument is that the Baltic is the more important of the two theatres of major conflict. But remember, there is also sustained operations in the high Arctic, in the White Sea on both campaign seasons, and in the Far East around Petropavlovsk and Vladivostok, which then didn't exist. Britain makes war from the sea because it's an island. British security is determined by controlling the sea, not by controlling land borders. This makes a difference to the way the British think about conflict. It is not accidental that the Royal Navy is the senior service. In almost all other countries, it is not the Navy, but the Army, which is the senior service. That is not the case in this country. So the war begins because Russia is encroaching on Turkey. The Tsar of Russia has grabbed Turkish territory. The provinces, which we now tend to think of as modern Romania, Wallachia, north of the Danube. This is a threat to the balance of power in Europe. It is destabilizing for the whole of Eastern Europe. It threatens the integrity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is a vital balancing element. And the Russian Tsar has reached an age where he's decided that faith is more important than common sense, because he thinks he probably hasn't got much longer to go, so he'd better do something in favour of his church, and that means liberating the Orthodox Christian population of European Turkey, which then included Bulgaria, modern Romania, and large parts of the Balkans. Tsar Nicholas has been playing the game with the British for most of his reign, since 1825, but at this point he is increasingly under the influence of pan-Russian xenophobes and the Orthodox Church. Does that sound in any way familiar? Right. What we're looking at is a very small version of Nicholas I currently in the Kremlin. And when those gigantic guardsmen stride through the door and open it for him, that is Nicholas I's guards. And Nicholas I was as tall as those guardsmen. Vladimir Putin is not, and that, I think, is significant. Britain and Russia had been the external balancing elements in a European state system that revolved around Austria, Prussia, and France. And they were the two powers that enabled the Central Europeans to defeat and overthrow Napoleon, Battle of Waterloo, as the kind of wrap-up to that. And they had between them created a European state system which was relatively balanced, relatively stable, and prevented major acts of aggression across the next 30-odd years. British strategy was shaped by the experience of the Napoleonic Wars, the first total war in which Britain had been engaged. And the British would wage that war from the sea. They would fight for control of ocean territory, for the domination of economic activity, and they would use their army significantly to do something really important, which is capture and destroy hostile naval bases. Preventing the French getting Lisbon is the whole rationale for the Peninsular War, and destroying the naval base at Vlissingen is the reason for the attack we know as the Walcheren campaign, which changed the strategy of the Napoleonic conflict permanently and adversely for the French. The men who planned and conducted the more important parts of the Walcheren operation were the Royal Engineers. Among their officers was a man called Charles Pasley, who was wounded in the campaign, but he opened the engineer school at Gillingham, and he trained all of the Royal Engineers who went to the Crimea. And the punchline for this is, at the end of the Siege of Sevastopol, the Royal Engineers spent a long time blowing up the Russian dockyard. This isn't in all the standard histories because it's not very interesting. Digging a hole in the ground to blow it up and make it useless, it's not interesting. But we'll get to that. So British strategy is not symmetrical with the strategy of other major powers, particularly not Russia, but not France either. So here's the Black Sea. At the time the war breaks out, the Russians have the Crimea. They haven't had it long, and they have taken Moldavia and Wallachia, all the territory north of the River Danube. And that is the casus belli. The British and French demand that they evacuate that territory within a certain period of time or face the consequences. It's at that point that the Russians, who are already engaged in war operations against the Turks on the Asian frontier around the city of Kars, decide that they will use their navy to sink the Turkish fleet at Sinope. This is very one-sided. The Turkish fleet are small warships, the Russian fleet are very big warships, and they sink the lot of them and carry on firing long after they've surrendered. It's a really nasty battle. As far as the British are concerned, this is a declaration of war, because any navy asserting its rights on the open ocean is quite clearly challenging the British for a fight. So the British and the French demand the Russian fleet goes back to Sevastopol and does not come out again. The Russians obey. They also demand that they leave the Principalities by the end of March 1854 or else. Why the end of March? It's December. Why do you say end of March? Because that's when the ice breaks up in the Baltic and you can have a naval campaign. So even the timing of the outbreak of the war is naval, not military. Where did the army come from that gets sent to the Crimea? Well, here's the Russian fleet in Sevastopol harbour. This is by the great Russian artist Ivan Aivazovsky, who greatly liked the pre-war Russian fleet, which was a pet of Tsar Nicholas. Baltic Sea, the ice retreats from the west into the Gulf of Finland and into the Gulf of Bothnia. So Russia includes Finland and all the rest of the territory right the way down to Danzig. So it's more than half of it is actually Russian coastline. Finland is a major economic actor. The capital of Russia, as you know, is St. Petersburg. It is not Moscow. And right outside St. Petersburg is a massive naval fortress called Kronstadt, which is the key to securing St. Petersburg against attack from the sea. It was built by Peter the Great because he knew the British would throw things through his window on the west. And these things might be quite dangerous. The Russians have a large Baltic fleet, but it is now technologically obsolete because they have no steam-powered capital ships. The British Baltic Fleet is almost entirely made up of steam-powered ships, including the line of battle. And that's going to be significant. The Russians are not going to come out and challenge the British at sea, in the Black Sea or in the Baltic. They simply put their big ships away and defend on their forts. So they've effectively abandoned the sea at the outbreak of war. The critical locations are the Åland Islands, halfway between Sweden and Finland. That is a Russian naval base in process of being built to dominate Sweden and force Sweden to follow Russia's lead. Helsingfors, or Helsinki as we know it today, and the great fortress and naval base at Sveaborg, and Reval, or Tallinn as it is today in Estonia, and Kronstadt and St. Petersburg. It's going to be an economic war of blockade. Stopping Russia exporting bulky primary produce is the key to breaking its economy, and that still holds today. The Russians are exporting timber, they're exporting grain, they're exporting pig iron, hemp, flax, other forest products. The British have found other supplies for most of these goods in North America, particularly in Canada. They've adjusted their customs rates so that the Canadians are producing most of these goods. And if they need them, they're quite happy to smuggle them. What they're not allowing is trade going the other way. The Russians want to buy steam engines, high technology, weapons. They're blockading that. The Russian economy cannot function without major export sales, and that hasn't changed either. So economic warfare is the basis of defeating Russia. Russia will be structurally bankrupt within 9 months of an effective blockade being declared. Right? This is not an economy that can endure pressure. We just haven't pressed it hard enough recently. This is the primary area where you're going to put that pressure on. The other place, of course, is in the south, where they're exporting huge amounts of grain out of what we now call the Ukraine. Those exports are barred as well. So Russia is choking on its own produce, and it's got no money. The British have spent a long time working out how to fight the Russians, and they don't get it wrong. The Commander-in-Chief of the fleet going to the Baltic, Admiral Sir Charles Napier, cousin of some army fellows who were also called Napier, and like them, he's wild, dangerous, and very, very effective. Napier is appointed because he has a long track record of being very successful, and he's also a radical liberal, so his politics are also a threat to autocratic Russia. He is the popular naval hero of the era, and the government thinks they'll get some kudos for appointing him. It doesn't work out well, for reasons that I will explain later. His flagship is called HMS Duke of Wellington. It is the biggest and most powerful steam-powered battleship in the world. It's brand new. It was renamed from another name on the day Wellington died, to capture his spirit for the nation. The figurehead is indeed the Duke. It has 131 guns. There is nothing like it in any other navy in the world. It is far too big to operate in the Baltic, which is shallow and difficult. It's a great flagship, but if you want to attack the coast, this isn't the platform to attack it in. It's too deep in the water. You need shallow draft gunboats. They do take along a squadron of old 74-gun ships that have had engines fitted. If you look between the mizzen and mainmast on the Blenheim there, you'll see a tall stovepipe. These old ships have had engines fitted so they can navigate the intricate waters of the Baltic to attack Russian forts. Or French forts if we went to war with them. We were fairly ambivalent about who we fought. They're planning for a coastal campaign, but the government does not buy any coastal warfare equipment. They send a battle fleet, well aware that the Russians will not come out and fight. So we have command of the sea, which is not going to be challenged anyway, but they do not build any gunboats for coastal operations. They build no specialist craft for amphibious warfare, and they don't send any troops to the Baltic at all. Because the small British Expeditionary Force, which is what it is, has been sent to Istanbul to secure Istanbul against a Russian attack. How are the Russians going to attack Istanbul? They're going to sail from Sevastopol. The Black Sea Fleet is an amphibious lift force, and if you sail from Sevastopol, you get to Istanbul twice as quickly as you would if you sailed from Istanbul to Sevastopol, because the winds and currents are all driving to the west. That's why Sevastopol has to be taken out. That is the base to launch an invasion of the Ottoman Empire. The Russians had done it in 1833 when they sent an army to protect Istanbul from the Egyptians. So the British were acutely aware of this. So in the Baltic, they sent a fleet to hold the position. They didn't send any assets to project power into Russia. And that was a major oversight, which meant that command of the sea was taken for granted, but there was no opportunity to exploit it because there was no equipment, no troops to actually do that job. The first major operation in the Baltic is the attack on the fortress of Bomarsund in the Åland Islands, and you can see the forts marked there. Basically, this position was completely outflanked because the Russians were unaware that there was an open back door into the Lumpar Bay, which is an enclosed secure anchorage. They hadn't done their homework, and the British surveyors who had the Russian charts worked this out. 10,000 French troops turned up to capture the fort because there were no Brits to spare. So the French took the forts. They were all blown up, and these islands have been demilitarized ever since 1856. They are, under international law, guaranteed as non-belligerent. And the Ålanders are enormously proud of this. They live halfway between Finland and Sweden. They're technically part of Finland, but they all speak Swedish. So they're just a bit different. But this is a brilliant operation of war. British casualties, 1 Royal Engineer officer, a couple of Matlows, and that's about it, really. So this is clever warfare. There's no heroics here. This is just doing the job scientifically. This is Royal Engineer warfare. Here is Charlie Napier in his straw hat watching HMS Bulldog bombarding the Russian fort at a range of 3,000 meters. This is long-range precision fire for the first time from the sea. They've developed these new 68-pounder cannon for long-range sustained bombardment. Napier is there. The man behind the cannon is Admiral Henry Chads, commander of the Navy's gunnery school. There are 2 other admirals in the picture as well, Michael Seymour and the French Admiral Percival Deschênes. And the 2 middies up there at the top of the ship, they are spotting the fall of shot. Right? This is scientific gunnery, 1854. Within a year, they will have rifled artillery, and they'll be firing even further. The Russians cannot fire back. They don't have the artillery. And that applies to land war as well. So here is Bomarsund after the Brits and the French had finished with it, smashed to bits, completely useless. And there are a couple of British warships in the bay, just in case. The Ålanders have rebuilt part of the fortress as a tourist attraction, but they haven't put any cannon in it, or at least not ones that fire. It's a beautiful place, if you like that kind of sea area.
If you're watching this, you're our type of people. The Victorian Military Society, founded in 1974, brings together everyone who loves the little wars of the Victorian era. The scholars, collectors, war gamers, reenactors, family historians, anyone who wants to keep that history alive. And obviously I'm one of them. Members receive a print subscription to the quarterly journal Soldiers of the Queen, which includes original research, fresh insights, and access to the digital archive of every issue since 1975. It's amazing. They also get an e-newsletter, Soldiers Small Book, for timely updates. You'll also receive invitations to society lectures, exhibitions and seminars with recent speakers including Ian Knight, the fantastic but sadly late John LeBand, Anne Sampson, Amapol Singh Sidhu, Gurinder Singh Mann and Keith Surridge, all of whom have been on this show, as well as today's speaker, Prof. Andrew Lambert. If you're tracing a regimental story, digging into family history, or want to contribute serious research, this is the community for you. Just head to the Victorian Military Society website, the link's in the description below. Join us and be part of a growing network keeping up this history.
So the first Baltic campaign ends with a bit of an anticlimax. There's a rumour in early November that Sevastopol has been taken by assault. And everybody in London gets hugely excited and thinks, great, now let's take something big in the Baltic and we've done the job. So they send a message out to Napier and they say, why don't you have a go at Sveaborg and Helsinki? That's kind of, within your range, isn't it? And Napier writes back, he says, I don't have a single gunboat. I have no equipment for this operation. I just have some very large deep draft battleships. And if I try and sail them into Sveaborg, they will be sunk. It would make the charge of the Light Brigade look really, really clever. So the government, embarrassed by their own stupidity, then decides the best thing they can do is sack the admiral for telling them the truth. And this leads to a lifelong campaign for the rest of Napier's life. He gets back into Parliament and embarrasses and humiliates the minister responsible and destroys his political career. It was a shameful piece of business by a very shabby government. So here's a Russian map just to remind us that we are dealing with the Russians here, looking at those distances. So the British Army goes to Istanbul, they camp at Scutari, they then move up to Varna on the coast of what is now Bulgaria to intercept the Russians if they cross the Danube and march south to get to Istanbul. That's what they're doing at Varna. They're also dying of cholera. The French have brought that with them from North Africa. Massive casualties, both British and French armies, before they sail for the Crimea, which means they're quite badly weakened both numerically and physically by the time they get there, often forgotten. In many ways, when the Russians signed the deal with the Austrians to evacuate the principalities, the war could have ended. But the Russians will not renounce their aims, and so we have an army which is literally rotting to death at Varna. And the government says, OK, let's go to Sevastopol. The object of going to Sevastopol is to destroy the naval base. It is not to capture anything. No British soldier ever marched a day's walk from the beach in the whole of the Crimean War, unless he was a POW. Yep. So this is an entirely coastal maritime war about sea control. Destroying the Russian naval base and sinking their fleet is the war aim. And we see that in the Treaty of Paris, which says the Black Sea is demilitarized. You will have no dockyards, no naval bases, and no warships on the Black Sea. And that stipulation survives another 15 years. So the army goes to the Crimea as an afterthought. It was sent to save Istanbul. Now it's sent to save Istanbul strategically rather than tactically. But it's all planned by a royal engineer called John Burgoyne. Everybody forgets Burgoyne. He's the brains of the army that goes to the Crimea. He is a lifelong engineer officer. He was in the Peninsular Campaign with Wellington. He was Inspector General of Fortifications. And he has been out to Istanbul to plan all of this before the rest of the army arrived. He is seen as the leading strategic thinker in Britain. So if you forget the Royal Engineers, you will never understand what they're doing in the Crimea. On the 17th of October 1854, the British and French have landed. They've won the Battle of the Alma, and they've then rather foolishly marched round Sevastopol to attack it from the south, because the French marshal didn't fancy attacking the one fort on the north of the harbour. Sevastopol harbour, very deep inlet, superb base for sailing ships. On the north side, it's quite high ground, and the Russians had a fort up there, and the French marshal, after the Battle of the Alma, didn't fancy going after that with troops. So they marched round on the hypothesis that the southern defences were weaker. They weren't. They should have gone for it straight after the Battle of Alma. They didn't. The French delayed, and then the French marshal wouldn't act. This is where Raglan is at fault. He did not override his colleague. He did the thing he was sent to do, which was to keep up good relations with the French. They sent him because he was excellent at French and a very polite gentleman. And the French were known to be a little excitable, so they thought that the calming draft of Lord Raglan would keep them. On the day of this siege, that the bombardment opens, the fleet attacks the castles at the entrance to Sevastopol harbour as a distraction. They know they can't get in because the Russians have scuttled half their fleet in the mouth of the harbour. The French and the British are then meant to batter down the Russian defences and storm the position. Before the French even open fire, Russian counter-battery fire has blown up their magazine. They take no part in the attack that day. The British then batter down the Russian positions in front of them. They do not attack because Raglan cannot coordinate with his French counterpart, who has disappeared. Because his army is not in a position to attack. He doesn't want the British to attack and gain all the laurels of the victory. Yep. So be careful who your friends are. As a result, instead of taking the position on the 23rd of October, which was always the plan, this was meant to be a 12-week campaign. Land, secure, capture, destroy, depart. They were never meant to be there for the winter. This wasn't a failure of logistics, it was a failure of operations. So this failure on the 17th of October condemned the British Army to stay in the Crimea over the winter. The winter supplies come out and they're destroyed in a hurricane. So things get to be pretty unpleasant. But there was no intention of holding ground here. This was a seize and destroy and retreat mission, not a campaign to conquer territory. and you always have to recalibrate for that. As you all know, at least as well as me, if not better, the British and French divvy up the lines because we don't have as many troops as the French, and the British Army gets a lot of very heavy artillery and sailors up from the fleet to help batter down the defences of Sevastopol. So this is a very long siege operation, and it leads to some famous land fighting, but essentially the British and the French have the power to squeeze Sevastopol into surrender. The only question is how long it takes. And it's easier for the British and French to get reinforcements and resupply into this theatre than it is for the Russians. They have no railway south of Moscow. They have terrible roads, and in the winter the rivers freeze up, they can move nothing. So the Russians are dying of starvation, they're running out of ammunition. The British and the French are better equipped. Here's a more contemporary map, and again you can see the blue and red lines with the French on either side of the British. But right there in the middle is the naval base with 6 huge brand new dry docks for the Russian fleet. Those were built by British engineers, so the British know exactly what's there and what it is they want to destroy. In order to defeat the Russians in the Crimea, they launched the campaign to control the Sea of Azov. So this is landing at Kerch in the spring of 1855, Anglo-French and Turkish forces. They open up the Straits of Kerch, which now have a bridge over them. You'll be familiar with that. It's a Ukrainian target. And they sweep round the whole of the Sea of Azov, destroying fodder, grain, fisheries, and windmills. Windmills obviously are grinding the corn. This means the Russians are having to reach far further back for their logistics, and they simply cannot deliver the goods because they're delivering stuff from the River Don across the Sea of Azov by boat. Once the Allies have command of the Sea of Azov, they cannot do that, and they can't move enough material by land because the draft animals are eating all the fodder. There's simply not enough to eat in the Crimea. It's not a great producer of anything much other than grapes, which are useful but not essential. So the Royal Navy squadron in the Sea of Azov breaks the siege of Sevastopol. It's a logistic failure that forces the Russians to admit they will have to evacuate. They stand the Battle of the Chernaya as a last desperate heroic attempt. They fail. And then when the bastions are captured at the end of August, early September, they retreat, as they had planned to do. They cannot hold that position because they cannot sustain their forces, both with food or ammunition. They also have to send all their cavalry away because they have absolutely run out of fodder. So they're not capable of mobile warfare either. In the Sea of Azov, extemporized rafts are used to bombard positions. This is Taganrog, which was quite an important rendezvous. Innovative new warship methods being deployed. The final attack on Sevastopol is supported by Royal Navy mortar vessels firing 13-inch mortar rounds into the city as well. And here are the French, cock a hoop, having captured the Malakoff bastion. This is the defining moment of the campaign for the French. They've got their glory, they put their flag in an important place. Now they can go home and celebrate. They don't want any more of this war. They're not interested in the rest of it. This is about getting glory for the new revived Second Empire, and they've got that glory. The units that are taking this position are imperial units. The Imperial Guard is here, the Zouaves are here. These are French elite units, and they're making a big statement about France. They also go home and invent a new dessert. It's called a Malakoff Gâteau, and it's a chocolate fort. Next time you're out, have a look for it. It's slightly overcooked and may add some kilos to your diet. The British attack on the Redan is again a failure. Poor preparation, troops not fully prepared. Doesn't really matter. The Malakoff is the only one that matters. The Redan's a diversion. The Russian view is they're massing troops just behind the defensive line. These guys are being hit by 13-inch mortar rounds every time they mass to prepare for an attack. They are losing a lot of troops day after day after day. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Nothing changes. A lot of Russians waiting around getting hit by stuff flying through the air. This is from the diorama in Sevastopol, which obviously we can't see anymore. There's then this amazing thing. They build a bridge of boats right the way across Sevastopol harbour. They scuttle, burn, destroy the fleet. They burn as much of the city as they haven't actually finished with. They retreat to the high ground on the north shore of Sevastopol harbour and just sit there and defy the Allies to do anything. It's winter. The Allies are not going to do anything. They're worried about another cholera outbreak. They're worried about logistics failure. So they're hunkering down for the winter. This is a bit medieval. The weather's changed. We stop war now. And the war goes into suspended animation, and it will not restart in the Crimea after the end of September. Instead, the Allies use some new armoured vessels. These are floating batteries to capture Kinburn at the mouth of the River Bug and the confluence with the Dnieper. This opens up the possibility of attacking Russia's main naval construction yard, which is at Mykolaiv, or Nikolaev as they used to call it, on the River Bug. That's where they built the entire Black Sea fleet. The British fancied going up there and burning it. The French really weren't interested, as you might imagine. Very interesting operation, very successful. Mortar fire, artillery fire, armoured vessels, completely overwhelmed Russian defences. We heard earlier about the Siege of Kars and the loss of that position by the Turkish forces. This meant that the last battle of the war is actually a Russian victory. And the Russians folded that into their narrative. Well, we won the last battle, we must have won the war. No, guys, you lost. You gave Kars back as well, so you didn't even get to keep it. So Russian pressure on the Ottoman Empire has been stopped, and it remains stopped for the next 20-odd years, which is quite a result, given how aggressive the Russians are. But we need to go back to where the war is actually wrapped up. And we'll go by way of the White Sea. There are two campaigns in the White Sea. Very important. They're commanded by officers who just come back from looking for John Franklin in the high Arctic. And the British have all of the charts of all of Russia's coasts because we exchanged charts with the Russians in the 1830s. And they didn't realize that they were never going to attack us in our waters, but we were going to attack them in ours. The charts for this war were transcribed into English measurements and English lettering in the order that the campaign opened. Black Sea, Baltic Sea, White Sea. The White Sea charts were printed in early May 1854, just as the ice was breaking up and it was possible for the squadron to go up there. So these, without the charts, you can do nothing. And the hydrographer of the Navy says, look, do check these before you use them. I think they're good, but don't trust them. They're Russian. They were good, but we did update them. So in the middle of this campaign, there is a fascinating naval battle between 3 British steam warships and a Russian monastery. As you know, the Russians are quite a belligerent people, and even their monasteries have cannon and their own regiment of troops as well. So this is rather embarrassing because in London, everybody thought this was ridiculous. Why are you firing at monks? But Russian monks are not the same as everybody else's monks. These are warrior monks. Apparently the Archimandrite was marching up and down the battlements, which are quite obvious, and his prayers were answered that no projectiles damaged the monastery. That isn't true, but it's a good story. So a lot of fun was made of the Royal Navy fighting monks, but they weren't just monks, they were quite grumpy monks. Out in the Far East, at Petropavlovsk, there's another naval battle. The Russian forces in the Far East are very small. They're concentrated around Petropavlovsk. This is before Vladivostok was built. An Anglo-French force tries to land on the south side of this position, go over the hill and capture the 2 frigates in the harbour. This gets very taut because the French admiral keeps changing his mind about what to do, and the British admiral eventually is beside himself. He retires to his cabin and commits suicide. The attack goes ahead and it doesn't end well because nobody's in the right mood to do this. The Russians then sink their ships and retreat inland, so that's the end of it. The Russian Far East isn't very important, but it is significant that Russia, France, Britain and America are all just in the business of opening Japan when they're fighting a major battle on the coast of Siberia. We go back to the Baltic. Here the Russians have laid a large minefield outside Kronstadt. This is the first major use of moored mines in warfare. Mines aren't big enough. They go off bang and they make a big splash, but they don't do more than damage the wardroom crockery. The Royal Navy immediately invents mine countermeasures using grapnels. They sweep up over 100 mines. And one British admiral decides he better find out how they work, so he presses the lever and it blows up on his quarterdeck. It cost him his eye, it killed a couple of Royal Marines, but his boss wrote that night back to the Admiral. He said, "A complete insight having been gained into the function of these devices, they will cause us no more trouble." And that was indeed the case. Kronstadt is now being held at risk. The Royal Navy is sitting right outside Kronstadt. So here is Kronstadt today. It's the island there. And the barrier that connects it to the mainland was finished by Mr. Putin, which prevents flooding of St. Petersburg, which was always flood prone. That is the stopper that's protecting the Russian capital from being attacked. So it's really important. And British officers are sketching the defences. And you can see this is Fort Alexander, the biggest of all of the forts there. So there are British ships in the middle distance, and in the far distance you've got Russian ships anchored up between the forts. So a massive display of firepower. And all the smoke is red-hot shot being heated. So the furnaces are going and they're getting red-hot projectiles ready because this is still a wooden ship fight. So this is British naval officer on the spot sketching the defences. There was no attack in 55. They only had 20 gunboats and 20 mortar vessels. They needed 10 times as many. So they went off and attacked elsewhere. They attacked Sveaborg. This is Helsinki is here. The open sea is there. The main dockyard is here in the middle. The gun batteries are out here. And as Mike showed you, that is a very, very narrow entrance. You know, if you're on a cruise ship leaving that harbour, you could throw a cricket ball to either side. It's bombarded for 48 hours from the sea by a combination of gunboats, mortar vessels, rockets, not heavy ships, all coastal warfare assets built for the operation, British and French, mostly British, but some French too. And the climax of the operation is the explosion of the main magazine on the island, which is going up here. Thunderous detonation, which stops everybody in their tracks. The Finns who've been watching this, they're not in the fort, they're in Helsinki watching as a spectacle, hear the British sailors cheering, and they decide the Brits are coming ashore, so they leave the city very quickly. And to this day, the August event is held to prepare for the annual firework display at the end of the year. And if you win the firework display on the day that the magazine exploded on Suomenlinna, you get to do the Christmas firework decorations. So the Finns have a sense of humour. They were not involved. They were not loyal subjects fighting for the Tsar. They left the Russians to die. Several thousand Russian soldiers, sailors were killed in this battle. Battleship was sunk. Most of their gunboats were burnt. Massively successful. Not a single Allied serviceman was killed. The worst injury was somebody burnt by a rocket backfiring. Now, the Russians scored no hits in this battle. It's a one-sided engagement. So the editor of the London Times said, between you and me, he said, "We're not interested. Nobody's been killed or wounded. It's not very, it's no disasters. We'll not report this." It's literally forgotten because nobody got killed and wounded. Certainly nobody famous. Massive justification of what Napier had said the previous year. With these assets, it could have been done the previous year. Government didn't build them. Takes us back to the Crimea. Here is one of, I forget which photographer took this, but here are the docks, the 6 dry docks that were the centre of this operation, built by the British, demolished by the British. Here is Simpson's engraving, and there at the bottom of the dock are the Royal Engineers. There at the top of the dock are the French officers, realising that the Brits plan to do this to their dockyards as well. There are the French guys. So French officers saying, what the hell are those crazy Brits doing? Why are they drilling a hole in the base bottom of the dock? They're Royal Engineers. That's their job. Every year, the Royal Engineers' annual exercise was the capture and destruction of a naval base. And if you're in Gillingham, you just march across to Chatham, knock down a bit of the wall and have some practice. And then you build the wall again. Yeah. So that's what it's all about. It's about stopping the Russians having a fleet in the Black Sea. When the war ends, and all wars end. It ends because the French have had enough. They've got their glory. The Russians are literally bankrupt. They're facing a rising tide of domestic opposition. And the peace is signed on relatively modest terms. The Russians agreed to give everything back to the Turks to apologise and behave in future. So a grand review is held to demonstrate how Britain won the war. And it is not the army. It is the navy. It's at Spithead. So we've got 200-odd gunboats and mortar vessels in a line from the Solent all the way around through Spithead. Victoria is coming through the lines in the Royal Yacht, which is just down there, reviewing a fleet of about 70 major warships and 200 coastal attack vessels, including 6 or 7 ironclad batteries. They conduct a mock bombardment of Southsea Castle, and they make sure that the entire diplomatic corps from London have been surveyed and brought down here to make sure they understand that on St. George's Day, this is what British victory looks like. It's a naval power relying on massive technological superiority, industrial capacity to outbuild all potential enemies. And that the next day, the Times says a new method of warfare has been invented, carrying the power of the sea deep into the land. Very, very positive. But much of the coverage of the land war is, of course, much more critical because it's highlighting the things that went wrong. The Navy did not get much wrong in this war, but then it was a remarkably professional organisation and had a lot of practice doing most of these things for a long time. So when we remember a certain kind of Crimean War, the Florence Nightingale version, the Grenadier Guards, NCOs, or even the French on top of the Malakoff, we're remembering a campaign, not a conflict. There's a Crimean conflict, but there's also a Crimean campaign, and the two should not be confused. Ultimately, Britain wins this campaign in the Crimea. It also wins the wider war. But that's not the end of Britain's troubles, because the alliance with France breaks down pretty quickly, and within 3 years we're thinking about doing exactly what we've just done to Sevastopol, to Cherbourg, which was built to threaten the British. And that involves Queen Victoria as well. So Victoria goes to have a look at Cherbourg. She takes some sketches. The Royal Engineer, who looks after her second son, is doing some sketching. She buys all of the souvenir postcards, and she tells Louis Napoleon III that no, the British are not going to be France's allies, ever.
So that's how Britain really beat the Russians in the Crimean War. Not with glorious cavalry charges or endless trench misery, but with blockades, gunboats, and the occasional engineer with a taste for explosives. The Russians may not have enjoyed it much, but it does make for a cracking story 170 odd years later. If you've enjoyed this film, and you're probably not Russian if you did, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, and join the ranks of Redcoat history. We've got more battles, blunders, and stiff upper lip moments coming your way very, very soon. I'll be back next week. In the meantime, YouTube and I think you'll enjoy the video that's on screen now. Give it a try.